I'm going to talk to you about what I call the human bug. This is actually the deep defect within our brains that drives us to destroy our planet. And the ways to overcome this bug, to gain control over our destinies. Why? Because today we know that the climate is being disrupted, that the air is becoming unbreathable, that the oceans are rising, that populations are shifting, and that pandemics will increase, that biodiversity is on the verge of collapse. We know. And we continue to produce, to consume, to destroy. How can humans be smart enough to invent planes, rockets, send satellites into space, unlock the secrets of DNA, and at the same time, stupid enough to use most of their power to extract fuels from the ground that are slowly killing them and the living species they depend on? What is going on in our brains? If you look at the makeup of the human brain, you will notice the presence of two different parts. An outer part located on the surface called the cortex, here that you see in yellow. This cortex gives us intelligence. It invented engines, plasma screens, high-speed trains, mobile phones. It developed especially in final stages of our species evolution around 100,000 years ago. But if you go deeper into the brain, you will find an organ of much older origin, here in pink, just below the cortex, which was already present in our very distant Stone Age ancestors millions of years ago. This organ, this pink thing within our brains, is called the striatum. And this striatum does not produce intelligence, it produces desires. It drives us to perform certain behaviors, driving us to do so by giving us pleasure whenever we do so with a molecule called dopamine. So what are the fundamental human desires? The behaviors that our striatum drives us to perform by giving us dopamine are those behaviors that since the dawn of time have helped us survive, eating, reproducing, exerting power, minimizing effort, and obtaining information. Every time one of these behaviors is performed, our striatum sends us a dopamine rush. And it's easy to understand why. For 99% of their existence, our ancestors lived in the hostile natural environment of the Paleolithic savanna. In such an environment, surviving meant eating first, feeding, capturing prey, and once a prey was caught, eating as much as possible, without limiting oneself, because in the living conditions of our ancestors, there was no guarantee of finding an equivalent prey for weeks. Dopamine was then released in the striatum of our ancestors. The second behavior necessary for survival was to pass on one's genes. For this reason, the striatum rewarded humans who had sex with a dopamine shot. And since the law of natural selection requires you to make more copies of your genes than your neighbors, the striatum rewarded those who had the most sex. For sex, as for food, the striatum was never programmed to limit itself. Then comes the third major objective of the striatum: to acquire social status. Social status confers a decisive advantage for survival, because in any hominid group, it guarantees access to more food and sexual partners. It thus increases the chances of survival. As a result, the striatum has always rewarded those who rise above the others with a shot of dopamine at every step in the social hierarchy. The fourth objective of striatum is to minimize its efforts to survive. This is a very old principle called homeostasis. Homeostasis has been the life-sustaining principle of every organism on Earth since the first bacteria in the primitive oceans. Its principle is simple: minimize energy expenditure and maximize energy input. In primates and later in humans, The striatum fulfills this function by rewarding us with dopamine whenever we make the least effort possible. And finally, the last essential human purpose is information seeking. Since the dawn of time, for a Paleolithic man, detecting information, such as a footprint in the mud, can mean life if it's a prey, or death if it's a predator. So make no mistake, millennium after millennium, his striatum rewarded him with dopamine whenever he detected such traces of information. These 5 great motivations embedded in our deep brain have been the guardians of our survival for millions of years. They have brought us to where we are today. So what went wrong? There comes the human bug. In the human species, the cerebral cortex that you see here in yellow has developed abruptly over the last tens of thousands of years. This part of our brain, gifted with abstraction and planning, intelligence and tool crafting, has progressively invented more and more sophisticated tools and technologies. And these inventions have allowed the 5 great desires of the striatum to be satisfied without limit. It began by throwing weapons for hunting, then the plow, cattle breeding and agriculture, which allowed more food to be produced, then pesticides and fertilizers, which increased yields. Faced with this growing supply, the striatum demanded more and more. Never programmed to limit itself, it can't help but take what is offered. And we see the result today. Humanity is eating more and more. Obesity is exploding on all continents. Fast food is king, and there is recent talk about food addictions. So much that for the first time in 2019, the World Health Organization announced that more people on Earth were dying from the consequences of overweight and obesity than from hunger. As a result, global agriculture now emits 24% of the world's total greenhouse gases. Let's turn to the second main desire of our striatum, sex. The sexual desire has undergone the same fate. As it developed, the cortex invented the internet, dating sites, and pornographic sites. The striatum, thirsty for sex for millennia, rushed to this plethora of offers. It has become addicted to pornography, so that humanity now consumes 136 billion pornographic videos a year, an orgy that emits 1/3 of the greenhouse gases of the airline industry just to run the computer servers. Third, our desire for social status has also shifted into high gear. With the cortex having invented the internet and social networks, billions of people can now seek to climb the virtual ladder of the hierarchy in online groups, gleaning likes that send dopamine coursing through their striatum. All this is also costing our planet a lot of money. The automobile, another invention of the cortex, panders to this same desire for social status, to the point that scientists now see the striatum light up before their eyes when a human is shown a nice sports car. To minimize our efforts, our brilliant cortex invented the combine harvester, the train, washing machines, the Hoover, and more recently, the electric scooter. So we don't even have to walk in the street, and voice assistants, so that we don't even have to press a button to order everything we want on the internet. The result is a gargantuan consumption of raw materials and, unfortunately, pathologies caused by a sedentary lifestyle, such as diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. Finally, to satisfy our thirst for information, we now gorge ourselves on continuous news channels, Twitter feeds, notifications on our smartphones, and endless TV packages. Our era has become one of infobesity, a pathology of information gorging that has turned into an addiction. We are caught in a trap. Our brain, originally designed to conquer the planet, has gone mad because it doesn't know how to stop. Why are we unable to stop? The mechanism that drives us relentlessly to increase our desires lies at the heart of the functioning of the striatum neurons. These neurons, which give us dopamine when we satisfy one of the 5 cravings, are programmed to demand more and more. As soon as they get what they want, it's no longer enough. This phenomenon is called hedonic habituation, which means habituation of pleasure in Greek. In the laboratory, it's been observed that when these neurons are constantly exposed to the same level of stimulation, let's say the same salary, the same car, the same phone, the same sexual partner, they get bored and stop releasing dopamine. The only way to force them to release this precious molecule again is to increase the doses. So you have to take more and more. In other words, a biochemical growth principle is at work in our brain. And this growth principle has materialized in the dogma of growth that drives our economy, a dogma that we can't get rid of and which is leading us to our ruin. So how can we regain control of our desires and stop destroying everything? To fulfill the ideal of St. Augustine, who said that the real wisdom is to keep on desiring what we already have. The basic law of human desire is dopamine. So how do we get it without destroying everything? One way of obtaining this precious molecule without continually increasing our material consumption is to consume less, but to be more aware of our sensations. For example, when we eat, taking more time, closing our eyes, turning off the screens, chewing for a long time while becoming aware of the flavors. All this allows us to eat less in quantity while having more pleasure. Today, therapeutic programs for overweight people show that this works. There's a simple exercise. Take a sultana and observe it before eating it. Smell it for a few minutes, then slowly swirl it into your mouth. All of this looking, smelling, tasting should last at least 10 minutes. During these 10 minutes, your awareness of flavors will open up and act as a sounding board for your pleasure. This is no joke. This exercise is proposed to patients suffering from compulsive eating, overweight, and obesity. They start to eat less, lose weight, and rediscover the sensation of pleasure, a sensation they had lost in their mechanical consumption, where only the quantity mattered. How can we develop our awareness capacities? Mindfulness meditation techniques are one way. When the hamburger, the new phone, the luxury car, the 10th dress or pair of shoes only give temporary pleasure, the use of mindfulness resets the threshold of sensitivity. After a number of hours of practice, it becomes possible to experience real pleasure with very little. Similar effects can be achieved in the pursuit of social status. Rather than accumulating virtual relationships on social networks, enjoying a few select relationships and cultivating them through dialogue and meals together will stimulate your striatum more. Similarly, rather than scrolling through news websites on your smartphones, take the time to carefully read some well-researched articles. This will allow you to analyze information in depth and derive a deeper and more lasting satisfaction. In the field of sexuality too, more chosen, more conscious relationships will avoid the desensitization phenomena that accompany sexual addiction. But the second way to get dopamine in a positive way is to develop altruism. Here, the goal is to share rather than accumulate, because we know that accumulation has no limit. Experiments conducted at the University of Zurich showed in 2018 that, in this case, our striatum starts to release dopamine. In these experiments, scientists tested the behavior of men and women who were given a given amount of money and simply had to choose whether to keep the money for themselves or give a part of it to a stranger. A difference between men and women became apparent. While men mostly chose to keep the money and their striatum gave them dopamine, women mostly chose to share it and their striatum gave them dopamine too. Altruism therefore releases dopamine, at least in women. Why does this happen? Further studies have indicated that this is a nurture effect. In most cultures around the world, little girls are valued for being altruistic. This gives them social status, which is the striatum loves. Of course, boys are encouraged when they are competitive or individualistic. But the good news is that the striatum can be rewired. All it takes is a new social discourse. The admired and powerful people should no longer be those who win a lot, but those who give a lot. Finally, the third way to get dopamine is developing intellectual curiosity and a thirst for knowledge in young and old alike. It's also a way of forcing the striatum to releasing dopamine. Experiments have shown that when children are taken to museums, asked quiz questions, or played trivia games, their striatum releases dopamine, which then helps them memorize knowledge. We can make generations of knowledge addicts just by valuing knowledge. This is the key. We need to understand that the primary needs of our striatum are now inadequate for the situation we're in. For millions of years, they have helped us to survive, but now they are leading us to our doom. We must now replace them with new desires. Mindfulness, altruism, and knowledge are among them. There are surely others, but one thing is certain. We will have to trick our own brain and resist the temptation of eternal growth. Otherwise, it will destroy us. And I thank you very much for your attention.